The silence on the range was never truly silence. Not when someone like him was present, even if no one bothered to look twice. At 72 years old, John Griffin Walker moved through the early morning mist like a shadow that had refused to disappear with time. To most people arriving at the training facility, he was simply the maintenance veteran, the man responsible for keeping the range clean, organized, and functional before the real work of elite training began. He wore a faded olive jacket, simple work gloves, and carried no visible authority. Yet there was something in the way he observed every detail that suggested experience far beyond his role. The facility itself was located on the outskirts of a controlled military training zone in the United States, surrounded by open fields stretching nearly a mile in every direction, with steel targets positioned at measured distances of 100, 300, and 600 yards. Everything here was precision, discipline, and reputation. But on this particular morning, something disrupted the usual rhythm. A transport vehicle rolled in at exactly 0700 hours, carrying a specialized Marine sniper evaluation unit. The doors opened and a group of highly trained operators stepped out, led by Sergeant Ethan Cole, a man in his early 30s with a sharp posture and a reputation for unmatched accuracy under pressure. His team followed closely, scanning the environment with the confidence of people who had never been seriously challenged in their field. The moment their eyes landed on the old man sweeping the concrete near the firing line, a quiet misunderstanding formed instantly. To them, he was background noise, part of the infrastructure, someone who had long outlived relevance in their world of speed, optics, and advanced ballistic systems. Ethan Cole adjusted his gloves, glanced at his team, and made a passing comment that carried just enough weight to change the atmosphere. He questioned whether the maintenance staff ever truly understood what it meant to compete on a real range, not as workers, but as operators. A few of the younger snipers chuckled lightly, not out of cruelty, but out of assumption, the kind of assumption that comes from never being forced to reconsider one's own limits. John Walker did not respond immediately. He continued sweeping, the brush moving across the ground with steady rhythm, as if the conversation did not concern him at all. But inside the control office nearby, Range Officer Michael Daniels observed the interaction through the glass. Daniels had worked at this facility for over 15 years, and if there was one thing he had learned, it was that silence often meant more than words. Something about Walker's stillness felt intentional, not passive. The Marine unit began setting up their equipment along the firing line, unfolding cases, checking optics, calibrating scopes, and logging data into digital systems designed for maximum precision. Everything was modern, efficient, and methodical. Yet every few seconds, one or two of them glanced back at the old man, expecting him to behave like someone who belonged to the background. Instead, Walker finished sweeping, placed the broom neatly against the storage rack, and walked slowly toward the observation board. He stopped just short of the group, looked at the schedule posted for the day's evaluation drills, and spoke for the first time. His voice was calm, measured, and without effort. He asked if the competition they were preparing for was open to participation beyond the standard evaluation team. The question was simple, but it landed in the space between them like something unexpected. Ethan Cole raised an eyebrow, slightly amused, slightly curious, and asked if the old maintenance worker was seriously considering joining a Marine sniper evaluation cycle. The tone was not disrespectful, but it carried disbelief, the kind that assumes no real answer is possible. For a brief moment, the entire range felt suspended. Wind moved across the open field, flags on the poles shifted direction slightly, and even the distant sound of equipment preparation seemed to quiet down. John Walker looked at the schedule again, then back at the firing line where the Marine unit stood assembled. He did not smile, nor did he hesitate. He simply said he would participate if the rules allowed it. That was the moment the atmosphere changed without anyone fully realizing it. It was not laughter, nor confrontation, but a subtle shift in attention. Range Officer Daniels stepped closer to the window, narrowing his eyes slightly, as if trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he thought he knew about the man who had worked at this facility for years. Ethan Cole exchanged a quick glance with his team, and for the first time, there was something resembling curiosity rather than confidence. The decision was made quickly, as military training environments often require immediate structure. If the old man wanted to observe, he could observe. If he wanted to participate under supervised conditions, there was no immediate rule preventing it. What no one realized in that moment was that the structure they were relying on was about to be tested in ways they had not prepared for. John Walker nodded once, as if acknowledging something only he understood, and stepped back toward the preparation area. The Marines returned to their equipment, but the rhythm had shifted. Conversations became shorter. Movements became more precise. Attention, once scattered, now occasionally returned to the old man moving quietly among them. And in the background of it all, the range remained unchanged, measured, structured, and waiting for what would come next. The atmosphere on the range shifted in subtle layers rather than sudden motion, as if the entire facility had begun to recalibrate itself around an idea no one had fully accepted yet. John Griffin Walker remained near the preparation area, quietly reviewing the posted evaluation structure without speaking further. To the Marine Sniper Unit, this was still an unusual distraction, something that did not belong in their structured environment of measured performance and controlled pressure. Sergeant Ethan Cole maintained his focus on his team, instructing them to proceed with their standard calibration routines, but his attention kept drifting back toward the old veteran, who moved with an unhurried precision that felt inconsistent with his assumed role. Range Officer Michael Daniels made a note in the control log, not because protocol required it, but because instinct suggested this situation would not remain routine for long. By 0730 hours, the evaluation cycle officially began. The Marine Sniper Unit was assigned to a standard multi-stage assessment involving distance estimation, target identification, timing control, and environmental adaptation under shifting wind conditions across the open field. The targets were placed at varying distances ranging from 150 yards to 650 yards, each requiring adjustments based on wind drift indicators mounted along the range perimeter. Equipment checks were completed, communication channels were tested, and the digital scoring system was activated. At this point, John Walker was officially listed as an unofficial participant under supervised observation status, a designation that allowed him to engage in the drills without affecting formal evaluation results. The Marines accepted this arrangement with mild skepticism, assuming it would be a symbolic inclusion rather than a functional challenge. When the first drill was announced, Ethan Cole took position with his team, demonstrating efficient coordination and disciplined execution. Each movement was precise, each calculation deliberate, reflecting years of structured training. Their performance was strong, consistent, and aligned with expectations for an elite unit. Yet as the drill progressed, subtle inconsistencies in timing began to emerge, not in their execution, but in their perception of the environment itself. Wind patterns shifted slightly, light reflection across the terrain changed angle, and the heat shimmer over the ground introduced minor distortions that required continuous adjustment. It was during the transition to the second drill that John Walker stepped forward for the first time in a formal capacity. He did not request attention, nor did he announce himself. He simply took position at a designated station and reviewed the parameters of the exercise. The Marines observed quietly, expecting procedural delay or uncertainty, but instead they witnessed immediate familiarity. Walker adjusted his position relative to the marked boundary lines with calm efficiency, as if he had done this exact sequence countless times before. Range Officer Daniels monitored closely, noting that Walker's posture, breathing rhythm, and visual scanning pattern aligned with trained operational behavior rather than maintenance familiarity. Ethan Cole narrowed his focus, now observing not out of curiosity, but analytical interest. The second drill began, designed to test adaptability under variable conditions. The objective required participants to interpret shifting environmental indicators and maintain consistent accuracy across a sequence of time challenges. The Marine team executed first, maintaining strong cohesion, but small adjustments became increasingly demanding as environmental variables intensified. When Walker initiated his sequence, the atmosphere changed again, not through dramatic action, but through consistency that appeared almost effortless. He moved through the drill without hesitation, adjusting to each variable as if it were already known rather than newly presented. There was no display of force or urgency, only alignment with conditions that others were still interpreting. The scoring system recorded results in real time, but the numbers did not immediately register as significant because the difference was not yet fully understood. Ethan Cole glanced at the display panel briefly, then again, noticing that Walker's performance metrics were not simply matching expectations, but operating outside the anticipated range of variation. No one spoke during this phase. Even the wind seemed to settle into a more consistent pattern, as if acknowledging the shift in attention across the field. By the end of the second drill, the Marines had completed their cycle with solid results. But the focus of the entire range had already begun to migrate toward the quiet figure who stood without reaction, reviewing nothing, waiting for nothing, as if the evaluation itself had not yet truly begun. The third phase of the evaluation cycle began under a slightly heavier silence than before, as if the range itself had begun to acknowledge that something about the structure of this day was no longer purely routine. John Griffin Walker stood at his assigned station without drawing attention, yet attention continued to find him regardless. The Marine Sniper Unit, led by Sergeant Ethan Cole, adjusted their formation for the next drill, which required higher precision under controlled environmental disruption. The conditions were simulated through adjustable wind systems along the perimeter of the range, creating subtle but constant changes in direction and intensity. Participants were required to maintain accuracy while recalculating every variable in real time, a task designed to separate consistency from adaptability. Ethan Cole reviewed his team's readiness with calm authority, but his focus repeatedly returned to the old veteran, who had not moved in the same manner as anyone else on the field. There was no wasted motion, no visible tension, only a kind of still awareness that did not align with expectation. Range Officer Michael Daniels, observing from the control station, noted that the data feed from the previous drill had already begun to generate irregular comparisons between participants, though nothing yet violated formal thresholds. The Marines began their sequence, each operator engaging with the simulated conditions in structured rotation. Their coordination remained strong, but the increasing environmental variability introduced a level of complexity that demanded continuous recalibration. Small delays in adjustment began to appear, not in accuracy, but in timing alignment between perception and response. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable at first, but in a controlled evaluation environment, even minor deviation becomes meaningful. John Walker stepped forward when his sequence was called, moving with the same calm rhythm he had maintained since the beginning of the day. The difference now was not in his presence, but in the way the environment seemed to align itself around him rather than forcing him to adapt against it. He reviewed the parameters briefly, then positioned himself with quiet certainty. There was no visible preparation ritual, no hesitation, only immediate understanding of spatial and environmental structure. Ethan Cole observed this closely, no longer with casual skepticism, but with focused analytical attention. The third drill increased difficulty by introducing layered variables, shifting wind gradients, time target exposure, and forced recalibration intervals between sequences. It was designed to test sustained cognitive control under unpredictable change. The Marine unit performed with discipline, maintaining structured communication and executing adjustments with practiced efficiency. However, as the drill progressed, the demand for continuous recalculation began to expose minor inconsistencies in synchronization between team members. Meanwhile, Walker's execution followed a different pattern entirely. He did not appear to react to changes. Instead, he seemed to anticipate them at a level that required no visible correction. Each transition within the drill was met without delay, as if the environment's variability had already been accounted for before it fully manifested. The scoring system continued to update in real time, displaying results that initially appeared stable, but gradually revealed a widening separation between standard performance and Walker's consistency curve. Range Officer Daniels leaned slightly closer to the monitor, reviewing the comparative metrics with growing focus. The data did not suggest anomaly in terms of equipment error or calibration drift, yet the pattern remained consistently unusual. Ethan Cole finally paused his verbal instructions to his team, watching the old veteran more directly now, as if attempting to reconcile observation with assumption. The Marines completed their sequence with professional results, but the atmosphere had shifted in a way that was no longer tied to competition alone. It was now about recognition of difference, not an effort, but in perception and control. As Walker completed his portion of the drill, he returned to a neutral stance, showing no sign of reaction to the recorded outcomes. The range itself seemed unchanged, yet those observing closely understood that something fundamental in their understanding of capability had already begun to shift, even if no one had yet spoken it aloud. The fourth phase of the evaluation unfolded with a noticeably different tone, not because the environment had changed, but because the perception of it among those present had begun to shift in a way that could no longer be ignored. John Griffin Walker remained at the center of that shift without ever seeking it, positioned at his station with the same quiet stillness that had defined him since the beginning of the day. The Marine Sniper Unit, now fully engaged in the evaluation cycle, prepared for the most complex segment yet, a structured sequence designed to test sustained adaptability under layered and compounding variables. Sergeant Ethan Cole adjusted his stance slightly, reviewing the updated parameters displayed on the field monitor. The next drill required participants to maintain accuracy across multiple staggered scenarios, each one introducing new constraints while carrying forward the effects of the previous stage. It was not a test of isolated skill, but of continuity under evolving pressure. Range Officer Michael Daniels, watching from the control station, noted that the system logs had now fully stabilized in terms of technical output, meaning any anomalies observed were not procedural but performance-based. That distinction made the situation more significant. The Marine team entered the drill with structured confidence, executing their roles with disciplined coordination. Each operator followed established protocols, communicating adjustments through brief and efficient exchanges. Their performance remained strong, but the increasing complexity of the sequence began to demand more than mechanical precision. It required intuitive adaptation to subtle environmental transitions that could not always be predicted through standard calculation. Meanwhile, John Walker stepped into the active sequence without announcement. There was no formal acknowledgement beyond system registration, yet the atmosphere around him seemed to adjust in response to his presence. The drill began its next cycle, introducing overlapping variables that affected visibility, timing, and spatial consistency across the range. Ethan Cole observed closely now, no longer viewing the veteran as an anomaly of curiosity, but as a participant whose behavior required interpretation. What he noticed was not speed or aggression, but continuity. Walker's movements aligned with the environment in a way that did not suggest reaction, but integration. Each adjustment appeared to occur without visible delay, as if decision and execution were part of the same continuous process rather than separate steps. The Marine unit completed their initial sequence with professional execution, but small divergences began to appear in their synchronization under layered conditions. These were not errors in isolation, but cumulative effects of increasing cognitive load. In contrast, Walker's progression through the sequence showed no visible accumulation of strain or adjustment lag. The scoring system, displayed across the main monitor, began to reflect a widening separation between expected performance curves and observed output. Range Officer Daniels leaned forward slightly, reviewing the comparative metrics again. The data remained within operational bounds, yet the pattern suggested something beyond standard classification categories. Ethan Cole finally lowered his binoculars for a moment, breaking from continuous observation, as if attempting to reset his frame of reference. The environment itself remained unchanged. Open field, controlled wind simulation, marked distance lines extending across the terrain. Yet the perception among observers had shifted from evaluation to observation of something less easily categorized. As the drill reached its midpoint, Walker completed another sequence without pause, returning once again to neutral stance. There was no visible reaction to the results displayed on the system monitor. The Marines, now fully aware of the disparity emerging in the data, maintained discipline but with a heightened sense of awareness. What had begun as a routine evaluation had evolved into a quiet redefinition of expectation, though no formal conclusion had yet been reached. The range remained silent except for the controlled systems in motion, but within that silence, understanding was beginning to take shape among those who had come to observe rather than participate. The fifth phase of the evaluation cycle began under a level of quiet anticipation that no longer felt accidental. as if everyone present had subconsciously adjusted their expectations based on what they had already witnessed. John Griffin Walker remained positioned at the edge of the active range zone, his presence still understated but no longer easily dismissed by those observing closely. The Marine Sniper Unit, led by Sergeant Ethan Cole, regrouped after the previous sequence with disciplined efficiency, though subtle changes in their internal communication suggested a shift from confidence to calculated reassessment. Range Officer Michael Daniels continued monitoring the system feed, which now displayed fully normalized operational metrics, meaning any irregularities could only be interpreted through human performance comparison rather than technical explanation. The next drill was announced as the most advanced stage of the evaluation cycle, designed to test adaptive consistency under continuous variable escalation. Unlike previous sequences, this phase introduced overlapping environmental changes that would not reset between stages, requiring participants to maintain control across cumulative stress conditions. Ethan Cole acknowledged the structure with a brief nod, instructing his team to prepare for sustained execution rather than isolated performance bursts. The Marines moved into position with professional discipline, their formation tight and communication minimal but precise. Each operator understood the nature of the task: maintain accuracy, adapt continuously, and avoid disruption and synchronization even as external variables intensified. As the drill commenced, the range systems activated a layered sequence of environmental adjustments. Wind direction shifted at irregular intervals, light reflection patterns across the field altered subtly, and target exposure timing became less predictable, requiring constant recalibration of perception and response. The Marine unit engaged with the sequence effectively at first, demonstrating strong baseline control and consistent adaptation. However, as the cumulative effects began to compound, small divergences in timing and decision alignment started to appear. Not enough to disrupt performance, but sufficient to increase cognitive load across the team. Ethan Cole observed this carefully, issuing minimal corrections through controlled signals, maintaining operational discipline while recognizing the increasing complexity of the environment. At this stage, John Walker entered the active sequence again without announcement. His transition into the drill was not marked by any procedural emphasis, yet the perception among observers shifted immediately. The system recorded his participation in real time, and the environmental variables that affected others appeared to interact differently in his presence. What became evident was not acceleration or force, but stability under change. Walker's progression through the layered conditions showed no visible disruption in rhythm. Each environmental shift appeared to be absorbed into his movement pattern without requiring observable adjustment cycles. Range Officer Daniels, now fully focused on comparative analysis, noted that the variance between Walker's performance stability and the Marine unit's adaptive adjustments had reached a measurable threshold that required documentation review. Ethan Cole, still maintaining operational oversight, narrowed his focus significantly, watching Walker not as an anomaly of curiosity, but as a reference point against which all other performance was unintentionally being measured. The Marines continued their execution with discipline, but the increasing cognitive demand of cumulative variables began to introduce slight inconsistencies in timing cohesion. These inconsistencies were not failures, but indicators of rising complexity under sustained pressure. Meanwhile, Walker completed each segment of the drill with consistent neutrality, showing no visible reaction to escalation or outcome feedback. The scoring system continued to update dynamically, reflecting a widening distinction between adaptive effort and stable execution under identical conditions. As the fifth phase progressed toward completion, the atmosphere across the range had fundamentally changed. It was no longer defined by competition or evaluation alone, but by observation of contrasting approaches to the same structured environment. The Marines remained fully engaged, disciplined, and operationally sound, yet the presence of the old veteran had shifted the reference point of the entire exercise without a single spoken declaration. The sixth phase of the evaluation cycle began with a noticeable tightening of focus across the entire range, as if every participant had unconsciously entered a deeper layer of concentration shaped by everything that had occurred before. John Griffin Walker stood in the active zone with the same calm posture he had maintained throughout the day, Yet the perception of him among observers had shifted from curiosity to measured attention. The Marine Sniper Unit, led by Sergeant Ethan Cole, prepared for the next structured sequence, which now represented the highest complexity level within the evaluation framework. Range Officer Michael Daniels confirmed system readiness through the control interface, noting that all environmental simulation parameters were functioning within expected operational limits, leaving human performance as the sole variable under observation. The drill began with an expanded adaptive sequence, combining all previous environmental variables into a continuous, non-resetting flow. Wind adjustment patterns, visual distortion layers, and timing variability now operated simultaneously, requiring participants to maintain stability across overlapping conditions without interruption. The Marine unit initiated their execution with disciplined coordination, maintaining strong structural communication and procedural accuracy. However, the cumulative nature of the environment quickly increased the cognitive demand placed on each operator. Small adjustments that had previously been manageable now required continuous recalibration, and the margin for timing divergence became increasingly narrow. Ethan Cole maintained command presence, issuing brief, controlled directives to preserve synchronization across his team. His focus remained steady, but his observation of Walker had become constant rather than periodic. John Walker entered the expanded sequence without acknowledgement or delay. The transition was seamless, and yet it immediately altered the observational dynamic of the entire range. What distinguished his presence was not any visible acceleration or forceful adaptation, but the absence of disruption despite continuous environmental fluctuation. Each variable introduced by the system appeared to be integrated into his movement pattern without requiring visible correction or recovery. Range Officer Daniels reviewed the comparative feed data with increasing attention, noting that the performance differential between Walker and all other participants had stabilized into a consistent pattern rather than fluctuating variance. This suggested not an anomaly of momentary advantage, but a sustained difference in operational response under identical conditions. The Marine unit continued their structured execution, maintaining high-level discipline, but the compounding nature of the drill began to introduce fatigue indicators in timing precision and decision synchronization. These indicators did not represent failure, but rather the expected consequence of sustained cognitive load under layered environmental stress. Ethan Cole adjusted formation spacing slightly to accommodate shifting performance rhythm within his team, maintaining control integrity while continuing to observe Walker's progression. Meanwhile, Walker moved through the sequence with uninterrupted continuity. The system registered each stage completion without delay, and the environmental variables that affected other participants did not appear to disrupt his operational flow in any measurable way that required adjustment cycles. Observers at the control station began to rely more heavily on visual confirmation rather than system interpretation, as the pattern being displayed suggested a level of consistency that challenged standard evaluation frameworks. As the sixth phase progressed toward completion, the atmosphere across the range became increasingly defined by comparison rather than competition. The Marine unit remained highly skilled and fully engaged, executing each requirement with professional discipline. Yet the presence of John Walker had shifted the implicit reference point of the entire evaluation. What had begun as a structured performance assessment had evolved into an unspoken study of contrast and adaptability under identical conditions. No announcements were made, no formal statements issued, yet every observer on the range understood that the meaning of the evaluation had already begun to extend beyond its original parameters. The seventh phase of the evaluation cycle began under a silence that felt heavier than before, not because of any external change to the environment, but because of the internal realization forming among those observing the range. John Griffin Walker remained in position within the active evaluation zone, his presence now fully integrated into the attention structure of the entire event. The Marine Sniper Unit, led by Sergeant Ethan Cole, entered this phase with heightened discipline, aware that the cumulative structure of the drill had now reached a level where consistency mattered more than isolated performance. Range Officer Michael Daniels continued to monitor system outputs from the control station, confirming that all environmental simulation modules remained stable and within operational parameters. This reinforced the understanding that any divergence being observed was not system-driven, but entirely dependent on participant response under sustained conditions. The seventh phase introduced a continuity challenge, where previous environmental variables were no longer segmented but merged into a seamless operational field. Wind fluctuation, visual distortion, timing variability, and spatial recalibration now existed simultaneously without reset intervals, requiring uninterrupted adaptation across extended duration. The Marine unit initiated their sequence with strong structural cohesion, maintaining disciplined communication and controlled execution. Ethan Cole remained focused on synchronization, ensuring that each operator maintained alignment with evolving conditions. However, as the sequence progressed, the sustained nature of the environment began to test the limits of continuous cognitive adjustment. Small variations in timing and coordination became increasingly difficult to correct in real time, not due to error, but due to the accumulated demand of constant recalibration. John Walker entered the seventh phase without disruption or delay in procedural flow. His transition into the expanded continuity field appeared seamless, yet the observational impact of his presence intensified significantly. What distinguished this phase from all previous ones was not simply performance comparison, but the consistency of response under unbroken environmental variation. While other participants demonstrated adaptive effort through ongoing correction cycles, Walker's movement pattern remained uninterrupted, as if the environmental variables were being processed without the need for visible adjustment. Range Officer Daniels reviewed the live comparative data stream and noted that the divergence between standard adaptive performance and Walker's sustained output was no longer fluctuating but stabilizing into a persistent structural difference. This observation prompted deeper attention to validation parameters, though all system readings continued to confirm full operational integrity. Ethan Cole observed this phase with increased analytical intensity, no longer relying solely on team performance metrics, but directly tracking Walker's progression through the continuity field. The Marine unit maintained high-level execution discipline, but the cumulative stress of unbroken variability began to introduce measurable cognitive fatigue indicators across the formation. These indicators manifested not as breakdowns, but as increased response latency in recalibration cycles, requiring greater focus to maintain synchronization across all operators. Meanwhile, Walker continued through the sequence without observable deviation from baseline rhythm. Each stage of the continuity challenge was completed without interruption, and each environmental shift appeared to be incorporated into his movement pattern without disruption to flow consistency. The system recorded these results in real time, but the significance of the pattern required human interpretation to fully appreciate its implications. As the seventh phase progressed toward completion, the range environment remained unchanged in structure, yet fundamentally altered in perception among those present. The Marine unit continued to perform within professional standards, maintaining operational discipline under sustained pressure. However, the presence of John Walker had now become the central reference point of the entire evaluation cycle. What began as a routine competitive assessment had transitioned into a continuous study of response consistency under identical conditions, with no formal declaration marking the shift. The silence across the range was no longer passive. It was observant, measured, and increasingly aware that the evaluation was no longer defined by the structure of the drill itself, but by the contrast emerging within it. The morning air at the range carried a quiet tension that felt heavier than the humidity itself, as if everyone present understood that something unspoken was about to be tested rather than announced. The old veteran stood near the edge of the firing line, unhurried, his hands resting on a worn gear bag that had clearly seen more years than most of the people watching him. Across the lane, a group of United States Marine snipers adjusted their equipment with the precise rhythm of professionals who had trained for moments like this, their movements synchronized but casual, as though this was just another assignment rather than a challenge that had already begun to draw attention. Lieutenant Carter Hayes, the youngest among them, exchanged a brief glance with his teammate Staff Sergeant Miller, both of them expecting little more than a demonstration from a man they assumed had long passed his prime. The invitation had been framed as a joke at first, a passing comment made during an earlier conversation about discipline and consistency, but it had been accepted without hesitation by the veteran, and that alone had shifted the atmosphere. Now, standing between steel targets arranged at measured distances, the range officer called for readiness checks, his voice calm, but carrying an edge that suggested even he was curious about how the moment would unfold. The veteran stepped forward first, not rushing, not performing, simply observing the field with a gaze that moved from target to wind markers to distance flags, as if he were reading a language that others only partially understood. One of the Marines muttered quietly that the wind had picked up slightly, but the veteran did not respond. Instead, he adjusted his stance by what seemed like a fraction, as though the environment itself had already spoken to him. When the first round of the informal competition began, the Marines went first, each taking carefully calculated shots, their results precise and consistent, drawing small nods from observers who appreciated technical excellence. The veteran waited patiently, watching each impact on the distant steel, noting patterns rather than reacting to them, his expression unchanged. When his turn arrived, there was no dramatic pause or announcement. He simply raised his rifle, aligned his position, and took a measured breath that seemed to settle the entire area around him. The shot landed cleanly, not surprising in its success, but notable in its timing, as if it had arrived exactly where it was always meant to be. The Marines exchanged subtle looks, their confidence still intact, but now slightly recalibrated. The second round introduced increased distance, and the conversation among the observers quieted further, replaced by focused attention. Lieutenant Hayes adjusted his scope twice, confirming alignment before firing, achieving another strong result. The veteran observed silently, then stepped forward again, his movements unchanged, his demeanor steady, and delivered another precise shot that mirrored consistency rather than spectacle. As the sequence continued, what had begun as a light-hearted challenge gradually transformed into something more reflective, less about competition and more about interpretation of skill developed over time. Staff Sergeant Miller began to notice that the veteran was not reacting to conditions in real time, but anticipating them, as though each variable had already been accounted for before it appeared. The range officer, now fully attentive, checked the wind gauge and frowned slightly, realizing that the adjustments being made by the veteran did not match conventional calculation patterns. Yet the results remained consistent, each impact reinforcing a quiet truth that required no explanation. By the midpoint of the session, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The Marines were no longer treating it as a joke, and the observers were no longer treating it as entertainment. Instead, there was a growing recognition that experience does not always announce itself through age or appearance, but sometimes through stillness and precision that cannot be easily taught or replicated. The veteran lowered his rifle briefly, scanning the field once more, then resumed with the same calm focus, as if the conversation had never been about competition at all, but about understanding a standard that existed long before any of them had arrived. As the final sequence at the range unfolded, the atmosphere had shifted into a silence that felt deliberate rather than accidental, as if every observer had collectively agreed that no unnecessary sound should interrupt what was happening. The old veteran stood at the firing line once again, his posture unchanged from the beginning, steady and unassuming, while the United States Marine snipers remained nearby, no longer exchanging casual remarks, but instead focusing with a level of attention that reflected genuine reassessment. Lieutenant Carter Hayes lowered his rifle slightly, not in defeat, but in consideration, watching the veteran as if trying to understand a pattern that did not rely on the tools he had been trained to trust exclusively. Staff Sergeant Miller adjusted his stance once, then stopped, realizing that further correction would not change the underlying outcome he was witnessing. The range officer remained still, his clipboard forgotten at his side, eyes fixed on the sequence that had become less about scoring and more about comprehension of consistency under changing conditions. The veteran did not speak, and he did not look for acknowledgement. Instead, he simply observed the environment once more, reading subtle shifts in distance markers and wind movement with a familiarity that required no calculation visible to others. When the final phase of the informal challenge was announced, it was done quietly, almost respectfully, as though the range itself had recognized that escalation was no longer necessary. The Marines took their final positions, each executing their shots with discipline and precision that reflected their training, achieving results that under normal circumstances would have been enough to conclude any discussion about skill. Yet there was no celebration, only awareness that something deeper was being measured without words. The veteran stepped forward last, as he had throughout the session, and the surrounding attention tightened without effort, drawn not by spectacle, but by expectation built through observation. He aligned his stance, paused only long enough to confirm conditions that others were still interpreting, and then delivered his final sequence with the same calm efficiency that had defined every action he had taken since arriving. There was no visible change in his expression afterward, no reaction to outcome, only a quiet lowering of the rifle as if the task had simply reached its natural end. For several seconds, no one spoke. The wind moved lightly across the range, carrying dust along the ground in small patterns that seemed to mirror the stillness of the moment. Lieutenant Hayes finally broke the silence, not with a challenge or a remark, but with a simple acknowledgement directed toward the veteran, recognizing that what they had attempted to frame as competition had instead revealed something closer to a standard of understanding built over time rather than intensity. Staff Sergeant Miller followed with a brief nod, his earlier skepticism replaced by a measured respect that required no explanation. The range officer stepped forward and closed his clipboard, exhaling slowly as if concluding a chapter that had not been planned but had naturally resolved itself. In the distance, a higher-ranking officer who had observed quietly from the edge of the range approached without urgency, stopping at a respectful distance before offering a formal salute that was not ceremonial in tone but personal in recognition. The veteran returned the gesture with equal simplicity, neither elevating nor diminishing the exchange. No further words were necessary. The Marines began to gather their equipment, not in disappointment but in reflection, each carrying away a recalibrated understanding of what consistent experience could look like when it was no longer tied to expectation or performance. As the session ended and the range slowly returned to its ordinary state, the veteran remained for a moment longer, looking across the empty lanes as if acknowledging a place that had temporarily spoken a language many had heard but few had fully understood. Then, without drawing attention, he turned and walked away at the same unhurried pace he had maintained from the beginning, leaving behind a silence that no longer felt like tension, but like respect that had finally found its form.